Gamers, gals, non-binary pals, welcome back to the greatest original content of all time, which is making a fucking tier list. Who would have guessed? We have ourselves every relevant and realistic deck we're gonna see in the upcoming YCS's for post-Phantom Nightmare. Spoiler alerts, expect to see a lot of bonfires resolve. So we've got basically every single deck here. We're gonna put them on a tier list. We're gonna give the quick rapid-fire ratings, and we're not gonna dwell too much upon it. So if you guys don't want the 50-hour-long pack tier list, this is the fucking Cliff Notes version. So, first off, we got Voiceless Voice. This deck, pretty good. It plays through Droll really nicely. It can play through hand traps really nicely because it does stuff like place from deck instead of like add from deck. It does sometimes lose the Droll, but there are enough hands in this deck that funnily enough could just hard play through it. You can play super stacky cards like Pre-Preparation of Rites. Skull Guardian is really good as just negate and a searcher and a big ass booty to kill your opponent with. Novox is broken because holy shit, it searches basically everything on planet Earth. But this deck is just good. It's an extremely solid deck. It's extremely consistent. The one issue it has is just that it suffers from crossfire in the terms of Droll and Lockbird just being in everyone's main and or side deck. But I mean, Vanadium existed last format and that deck insta lost to Droll, so that should tell you everything. Holy shit, Dragon Link. Dragon Link still exists. It's not good. It is just a definition of like an okay deck. Nothing about it is particularly good or special or better compared to any of the other decks. Why play a deck that needs 2 to 3 card combos as well as specific cards to resolve when you just play Fire King when any card resolving wins you the game? This deck's not bad. Again, it is just very playable. I don't think it's that good. Next, we got Vanadium. If you want to play a combo deck that loses the Droll and Lockbird, play either Silent Voice or a bad Fire King deck. It's basically like Dragon Link. Like, unfortunately, right now, it's just outdated and power crept, and it suffers even more in the terms of like crossfire to Droll and Lockbird, even harder than like Dragon Link or Voiceless Voice. Unfortunately, it's just not Vanadium's time anymore, and that's why I sold my core like 10 minutes ago. Next up, we got Kashira. Remember when this deck was being played for like 10 minutes because everyone was just so sick of the format? They were just like, fuck it, we're gonna play Kashira. We're just gonna sack wins by opening double hand trap, Unicorn Theosis Birth, because we're just the better fucking player. That shit was a fucking miserable experience. Like, Kashira sometimes is just so fucking fraudulent in its wins and its losses. Like, it really doesn't feel like Kashira is a deck that tests players' skill. It's a deck that tests your ability to sack into your fucking good draws. Like, sure, there are like a lot of people, a lot of pro players who've topped with the deck. There aren't a lot of people who've topped with the deck multiple times, you know what I'm saying? Anyways, this deck is... it's playable. I don't think it's good, but it's there. Next up, we got Pearly. Want to play a deck that loses the Droll? I mean, it's playable, technically. Is Pearly the first don't? Like, Pearly has a marginally okay Fire King matchup because you could, like, spin the stuff instead of having to destroy it. But at the same time, you lose the Droll, you lose the Imperm. There's so many cards that Pearly just loses to in most of its hands. Like, yeah, sometimes you're gonna open like 4 quick play spells plus Happy, but sometimes you're just gonna bite down on an Imperm on like Black Cat and you're just gonna like lose the game on the spot. You opened like 3 hand traps, you know what I mean? Like, sure, it's playable, fine. Next up, we got Orcust. Don't play Orcust. This deck is so poo-poo. Orcust is like as bad as it gets right now. Loses to a fuck ton of hand traps, loses the Shifter, loses the Droll sometimes, which is like insane when you're jigging with like Allure of Darkness, or you start with like an Orchestrated Return. Like, I don't know what it is with the Orcust, but this deck is a deck that should be put into the fucking coffin and laid to rest. Please don't play this deck. You don't want to get shiftered at locals. Speaking of Shifter, you have Sprite. You know that Sprite plays Shifter and like Dimensional Fissure now? What the? Why are people playing this deck? Don't play this deck. This deck is like Pearly, except somehow worse. Literally every single rank 2 the deck had got Powercraft. Exactly. Like, why play Djinn Buster when you could just play like any other card? Like, sure, you can still like Nightmare Imbly lock people, but guess what? There's a lot of Link summoning going on this format. Mashallah, Promethean Princess and a Dream. Next up, we got Vanquish Soul. Please don't play this deck. It's a shifter deck. One random Saki hand trap does not make a deck. Because guess what? Every single one of these decks can play Droll. And just because Pearly can play Droll and Lockbird doesn't mean we're putting this in fucking tier 0. We've got Fire King Wanted. I'm just gonna save you guys the time right now. Fire King Wanted, Rescue Ace Wanted, and Snake Eye Pure, tier 0. The package as a whole, absolutely tier 0. The decks themselves might be a little variant. Like we might see 30% Fire King, 20% Rescue Ace, and like 20% Pure. But just like fire packages as a whole, and decks whose like main goal is to go through like the fire engine line and to do like Promethean Princess with like Snake Eye, blah 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 blah. That stuff is going to be tier 0 in representation. Like these decks are kind of like this weird muddy conglomerate. Like holy shit, it is just absolutely disgusting what these decks can do. Fire King is easily the best one. The Fire King engine is just completely disgusting in what it can enable and what it provides. It forces your opponent to like interact with the deck at multiple points. Kirin is fucking the most broken obscene card to ever see the light of blade. Oh my god, like that shit is so broken. Rescue Ace is like close second. Like Rescue Ace will never beat the brick allegations because it plays like 4 fucking pseudo bricks into terms of like the trap cards and just like stuff like Preventer and Turbulence needing setup in themselves, as well as it's a lot weaker to hand traps. But I mean, DFL star stuff, broken. Like Pure Snake Eye is something that's being experimented with. I think Pure Snake Eye / Synchro Snake Eye might be better than Race, but it's gonna be so close in terms of like representation or like power levels that it's realistically not even gonna matter. Next we got Exo Sister. Oh boy, I sure love shifter decks. If I had to describe Exo Sister, it's just like marginally better than like everything in playable because it doesn't lose the droll and it can play shifter. I think Exo Sister is like, funnily enough, just a pretty good deck that has a good matchup versus the fire decks. Like every fire deck is touching their graveyard like their life fucking depends on it, because it does. And Exo Sister is just like, oh, you're gonna touch your graveyard? Oh, Caspatel effect? Martha effect? Everything effect? I don't think this deck is good. I think this deck, like, objectively is maybe in, like, playable. Like, high playable or tier 2. But I'm a little biased, and I think that just, like, relative to these decks, Exo Sister just has way better matchup versus decks in tier 1 and fire decks as a whole. Next up, we got Virtual World. Shout out to Leah for still playing this deck till the day she fucking dies, I guess. All you need to know about Virtual World is A, Shen Shen is really, really good versus the OSS stuff, because the OSS stuff has to send to graveyard as a cost. If your opponent's stuck on like nothing but Snake Eye names, they're basically fucked. Secondly, this deck can make Beatrice really, really easily. There's this little card called Transaction Rollback and the Mayakashi story that, you know, it's pretty good. It's pretty, you know, floodgates. But unfortunately, A, this deck gets fucking slaughtered by Shifter. B, if you want to lose to a single imperm, play this deck. If you imperm this deck's Beatrice, it's fucking Jover in 50 states and counties worldwide. I think this deck is actually pretty playable, but I don't think it's good. I think like it's around the same level as like Pearly in regards to what it accomplishes. I think that Virtual World just loses to too much stuff, loses the Shifter, loses to every fire deck on planet Earth. Tell me how this deck beats a single Fire King Skyburn. Tell me, just tell me. Next up, we got the Runic Synchro Piles. We're talking about like Runic Bestial. We're talking about like, I don't know, it's mainly just like Runic, Bestial, Despia, whatever. I think this deck is fine. It's okay. One of the big things this deck had going for it were that the Bestials were just really good in that one particular format, as well as the fact that it played through hand traps pretty well if your opponent didn't know what they were doing. But unfortunately, ever since the Schmitterson won his little YCS with this deck, it was just completely over. Everyone knows to like Ash Hugin, everyone knows to Imperm the Quem, and there aren't a lot of light and dark decks that exist for the Bestials to really take advantage of. So the Bestials are less proactive plays that like disrupt your opponent and generate you advantage, and they're more just like starters that sometimes fuck you over because you have to banish like your own Hugin, stuff like that. Unfortunately, Runic Bestial, I think, is an extremely metagame dependent deck, and right now this is just very much not the metagame for it. Honestly, I'd put this in Don't. You want to play a synchro deck? Play Pure Snake Eye. That goes for Runic fucking Goatee too. Runic Goatee is like down here. You try to tell me that a fucking bicorn Goatee pop is gonna be the fucking difference between tier 1 and tier 0? Speaking of decks in the water, we've got Tearlament. Wow, I sure love water decks. Wow, I sure love fusion decks. Anyways, don't play this deck. This deck is so okay. Like the Fire King pops just don't really mean anything to it, because guess what? You're playing fucking Tearlament, but again, you're playing Tearlament. If this deck opens well, it is really, really good. Maybe tier 2 or tier 1 if this deck opens optimally every single hand. Unfortunately, both hands are not very optimal, so we're putting this in playable. Next up, speaking of decks that want to open optimally, we've got Flu. Oh boy. Flu is, if you open optimally, if you open Rabina, Shifter, 2 hand traps, mashallah, bro. Tier 0. Fuck the fire decks. This is the flu deck area. Unfortunately, not everyone can fucking pull a remote duel special and open Shifter Ravina every single hand. Put this shit into playable. It can play Shifter, but my god, it loses to everything else. Sun Avalon, Rika, whatever plant pile. This is just Plant Link. That's all you need to know. In this deck, it's not very good. You want to talk about decks that lose to hand traps or drool or shifter? It's this one, baby. This is literally the European special. This deck is so cheeks unless some random Andy from Europe just takes it to a YCS or open and they'll just run it up the ladder and randomly top or win the event. It's crazy. Like, how do people just not know how to beat this deck yet? It's so fraudulent. Lose to Imperm, lose to Ash, lose to Droll, lose to Nibiru, lose to Dark Ruler. Like, I'm sorry, but this deck is fraudulent. Don't expect to ever see this top again. And if it does, I guess I'll eat a plant. Next up, we got Centurion. Deck that loses to hand traps and interaction. Don't play it. Like, this deck is fine. It's not like it's bad. It's not like it's good. It's just so solitary and flowcharty in all the wrong ways. You never want to play this deck, and you never want to play against it, because you know that you're just going to have a complete non-game. Next up, we got my favorite deck of the format, and of all time. We got Labyrinth, baby. As much as I want to put it into tier 1, this deck is probably tied with Silent Voice for tier below Fire deck. That should tell you everything you need to know. You could play a ton of main deck hate, like Different Dimension Ground. You don't hard lose to some of the removal that Fire King is playing, stuff like Subversion. I mean, like, you kind of do, but it's not the point. Lady is just a really, really strong card because it can't be targeted or destroyed, so it plays around like the Fire King's removal spell. The new Rumple 2 is just obscenely good. You could call basically like any single one of the fire name starters. You could call Princess, you call like Flameburst Dragon. Like, it's just a crazy deck. Unfortunately, like, the gap between fire decks and anything within like tier 1 is really significant. It's gonna be like a 30% thing where like Fire King's gonna take up like 54 of like top 64 slots, and then like the rest of the slots is gonna be filled up with like Lab, Silent Voice, and like maybe one Fluwanderese player who's scammed their way to the top. So yeah, I think Lab objectively one of the top 3 decks within the format, but unfortunately not a fire deck. At least not yet. Maybe there's a way to play Wanted Labyrinth. We've got Branded Despia. Don't play this deck. It's for your own good. And finally, Goblin Rider. Please don't play this deck. It's cool, I'll admit. It's cool. You can set up a board. It's a little wicked, but holy hell, this deck is so ass when it gets interrupted. There are a bunch of rank 3 packages like the Ghost Trick stuff. There's some stuff like the Speedroid stuff you could play. But if I ever catch anyone putting Speedroid cards into their deck, I'm going to beat them to death with a hammer I found outside of Home Depot. Anyways, that's the tier list. I think that most of this is pretty accurate in regards to what the metagame is going to look like. I mean, we're just going to see a shit ton of fire. Silent Voice and Labyrinth is going to maybe scam their way to the top, and everything else here is maybe just like a coin flip. Like, anything below tier 1 is basically just maybe it'll top. But anyways, let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below about the new format and why fire is your favorite deck of the format. That's it for now. Goodbye forever.